Time. I call the member for Heffron.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I make a contribution to the Government Sector Employment Legislation Amendment Bill 2016. I listened with close attention to the member for Ku-ring-gai because he always makes significant and important contributions to the House. But I suppose when he speaks in such effusive terms about the overall performance of the public sector, I do say, Mr Deputy Speaker, as much as I value his input, he needs to be careful because he gives himself ownership for their performance, something of which I'm sure he wasn't seeking to do. I rise to contribute to this debate not because the opposition opposes any of the specific legislative requirements, but in observations to the Premier's speech that was delivered actually by the member for Hawkesbury as Parliamentary Secretary, who described effectively the professionalism and the performance of public sector, both executive and non-executive, and made reference to the Premier's recent speech about public administration from October 2015 in the Garran oration, and talked about the observations made by Dr Kerry Schott as part of the Commission of Audit. Whilst I don't take issue with the contents of any of that and say that those people in the public sector are immensely talented and dedicated, I do want to make this observation, and that is that can anybody suggest that over the last 30 years there has been an effective improvement in the civil service of this state in the way in which they have provided advice to government or protected the citizens from errors of government of the day? What's transpired since 1986, because of decisions of the Greiner government, the public sector has been increasingly politicised for several reasons. One is because governments often get frustrated with the advice given to them by civil servants. Secondly, and Nick Greiner will tell you in reflection he was wrong, but secondly, the Honourable Nick Greiner, when he came to government, had a view that the private sector was more efficient in terms of the provision of public sector administration, and he effected substantial changes to the public sector administration in this state, believing that the private sector managers would be more effective. And if you speak to him privately in a candid moment, he's likely to tell you that one of the things he understood from his term in office was that public administration is an art of itself, and they do not necessarily equate. I don't say that if it relates to a public enterprise, but I do when it comes to the public service or civil service, an organisation that for decades has been much maligned. And I ask you to ask this question. One of the things that when you've been around for a long time, you actually have seen the transition and the history. Many of the people who get elected to politics are only here for a short period of time. People like me are not supposed to be in public office for the length of time I was in public office, and therefore I'm not supposed to have seen the history and the changes. But I ask you this question, and that is, does anybody think that the Department of Planning in New South Wales operates as intelligently, as effectively, it provides adequate advice to the government that it did when either Dick Smyth was the director or Gabriel Kibble? And the answer to that is no. Now, I often say to this House, since I've been here, that the Department of Planning is the greatest obstructor to economic investment in New South Wales. It never used to be, because they were there professionally able to ensure that government's objectives, irrespective of who they were implemented. Does anyone really believe that the Attorney General's Department has operated efficiently and as effectively and provided the right advice to government since the retirement of Trevor Haynes as the Secretary of the Department? We all know the answer to that is no. You only have to look at the way in which the government is implementing their amalgamation implementation of councils. Even if you, like me, disagree with the way in which they're doing it, had Gary Payne still been the Director General of the Department of Local Government, it would have been done and dusted by now in a proper way, rather than protests be all over the place. So I can give you examples of most departments. I can tell you, I can remember as a young fellow Despite what anyone said about Peter Cox when he was Transport Minister, he could stand up in this House and tell you which bus was late and which train was going to be late. Now, the Minister for Transport hasn't even got authority over his own, direct authority, can't even give a direction over his own department. So we have, and the other example I want to give you is, does anyone think, and I make no reflection to any people in this department, does anyone think the Premier's department operates as efficiently and effectively as it did when Jerry Gleeson was the head of the Premier's department? And of course the answer is no. So because the governments of the day, and it's not just your mob, it's also our mob, have broken down the civil service structure. That history has gone back not just through the English time, but all the way back to the Chinese times. It's broken down the structure of permanence. So what governments have tended to do, probably influenced by Treasury, is that they have made their cuts in particular areas. So the Roads and Maritime Services can't design you the West Connects to go through Sydney. I mean, they used to have people in there that did all these designs and models and costing options. You've got to go to the private sector and get the private sector to give you options. And it's the same in relation to where you want to put a train or a light rail or a metro. You're asking the private sector to do it for you, because you have run down, governments of the day have run down the expertise of their own civil service. So it's fine to use the words that the Parliamentary Secretary has used in their speech. But see, governments come and go and governments change. But if your own public service does not have the expertise to give you the costings and the options, if they used to be involved in long-term strategy, they're not anymore. I mean, when the Minister for Transport, for example, the former minister, announces a light rail project, is that part of any long-term strategy that the government has been working on in terms of a policy project? The public service, have they prepared plans in respect of that? The answer is no. Somebody said this is a good idea. We don't have the expertise to be able to do it. We'll call for tenders and see whether the private sector will come up with an option. And that's one of our failings, because governments need to plan in the long term. They need the expertise within the public sector to give them advice and costings. And that structure has been broken down. Governments tend to react instantly to the 24-hour media cycle. You need an intelligent, informed public service to be able to provide balance and advice to the government, to let them know the consequences. So in the old day, the minister would pick up the Sunday Mirror, who would be criticising him and the government for doing something, and he'd say to the head of the department, now I want you to do this straight away, because this will avoid all this criticism I'm getting. And they're in a position to say, Minister, if you do that, there's going to be this consequence, this consequence, this consequence, and this is the cost of so doing. And if the minister said do it anyway, the department would implement it in an efficient, loyal way, minimising the fallout. So in reality, we have continued on a long-term path. We have these talented people, but we have devalued their function. We have outsourced their function, and the only people that are poorer because of it are actually the people of New South Wales, and they don't know. So Treasury are having their win. They're cutting their recurrent costs on a yearly basis, because every minister's told every year, and has been for decades, you've got to offer up some positions. So they offer up some positions. Effectively, they offer up the government's own expertise of people they've trained since they were kids, people that they've had and progressed up through they were kids, and they've lost that particular expertise. The RMS today couldn't even tell you which road should be widened without having to outsource it and getting a consultant's report. And that is because and you should ask yourself, and you should go through this exercise, whether I'm getting all these consultants' reports, what is the cost compared to the fact that if you would have retained your own expertise within the department. So fix up your bill, fix up these legislative provisions, provide the movement of people, but let's go back to basics and see where the public service in this state has gone over the last 30 years and whether those decisions have been right.